Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kumo Mangochola. Welcome to Christian Arise, Season 1, Episode 1. Today we're with Thabiso Bogopa. We're discussing the role of the church towards gender-based violence. Good morning, Mr. Thabiso Bogopa. Thank you so much for welcoming us into your office. We appreciate it, sir. Can you kindly introduce yourself to Christian Arise? Who is Thabiso Bogopa?
Okay. Thank you so much for having me and for coming through. It is quite a privilege. My name is Thabiso Cavin Bogopa. I'm a social constructivist, an empowerment expert, and a therapist. Yes.
Okay. I went through your profile, and one of your key focuses was politics of gender.
Yes.
Which it aligns with our topic today.
Yes.
And can you kindly explain what exactly is politics of gender?
Okay. I think basically and typically what politics of gender does is that it looks at the coexistence of both genders and the tensions that arise in masculinities and in femininity, and tries to unpack this this coexistence that happens between genders. Yes.
Okay. In terms of gender-based violence, how is that area of focus aligned with gender-based violence?
Okay. I think what is critical is that because it unpacks, it excavates, it highlights, it conscientizes us. The most powerful thing in any activism is understanding. So it aligns with gender-based violence because it assists us to understand different genders. And you'd realize really in unpacking that you realize that men and women are actually more alike than they are different. So it empowers us to deal with the similarities and the differences between men and women. Yes.
Okay, so what is it that comes to mind every time you hear the word gender-based violence? What picture portrays in your mind every time you hear that word?
Of course, it's violence. The first thing that comes to mind is violence and what this violence means. But in the society that we are living in, you think of this violence in part, and you think of it as violence meted on the female person. But you never really think about it in the holistic sense that there is violence across both genders and that we need to represent clearly what this violence is, because on one hand this violence is physical, on one hand it is emotional, and when we go even further and we dig deep into these things, you realize there's also economic violence. There is social violence that comes from your traditions, your customs. There is economic violence that comes from the disempowerment of one, or when you can even look at things like affirmative action, they can be also considered as economic violence. There's political violence in terms of who you give the willpower to make decisions, to structure society or to structure a home, and who sits in that hierarchy, and what actually determines that hierarchy. Is it gender? Is it competence? There's a lot that goes into that. Yes.
So you were dissecting the different forms of violence, and even within gender-based violence, we can even go further to say male and female, husband and wife. We could say child, uncle. Do you think, with all these divisions of it, do you think as we try to address gender-based violence, do we touch each one of them in the same magnitude?
I don't think we do that. I don't think we touch them in the same magnitude, and that is problematic because what happens is that you take a certain group of society, or you take society and you subdivide it into subgroups, making binaries, and then you tell one subgroup of society that you are eternally a victim, right? So you make someone eternally a victim, and then on the one hand, in doing that, it's a little bit like mathematics. What you do on this side also happens on this side. Then you make one group of society eternally a perpetrator. But when you look deep, because I'm not a victim of postmodernism, so I do look into the literature, and you see the literature actually does not correspond with with the activism on the ground. because the literature will tell you, for example, and you read, this is available on academic edu, this is available on just scholarly, read scholarly, not on activism. You'd realize that men and women become violent differently, right? Women are most likely to become violent verbally. That will include gossip. That will include slander. That will include character assassination, repetition, dismantlement. And men are most likely to be violent physically. And that then, when you look into the literature again, you look deeper into that, you realize that women women are more susceptible and often hit men, and men only hit women in when men hit women, they hit, or they, when men become violent per se, when men become violent, they become violent in gross proportions, so it becomes vivid, as opposed to women, which becomes vague. But when you look at the activism on the ground, it does not represent the violence that is happening emotionally, does not represent the violence that is happening physically. So we have subdivided groups into binaries, and we're seemingly not achieving anything, because the violence keeps escalating, because we have a problem solution mismatch, and our activism is pseudo. Yes.
Do you think it could be the real reason why we're failing to fight against GBV? Do you think could it be because we do one solution fits all?
No, I don't think, I wouldn't put it that way. The reason why we are failing, and I've thought about this very deeply, thought about it very deeply for a couple of years. The reason why we are failing on the GBV frontier is that we are not honest, right? We're not honest. Any good therapist will tell you that if you don't become honest, the diagnosis is going to be wrong, and therefore the prescription is going to be wrong as well, because you gave us a wrong information, then we were able to deduce a wrong diagnosis. So if the pain is on the heart and you're telling me the pain is on the shoulder, and I keep telling you the pain is on the heart, but you are committed to believing that the pain is on the shoulder, I'm going to give you treatment for the shoulder. And as far as we are concerned, we have treated you, but the consequences and the aftermath keeps on increasing. I'll give you an example also in line to that. For example, our analysis is very poor, in the sense that, for example, when we talk about HIV and AIDS, people give you examples. In Botswana we have a million distribution of condoms. A million distribution of condoms. So we are doing well on HIV and fighting STDs. But a million distribution of condoms does not mean a million compliance in the use of condoms and that you are using them correctly. You understand? So if you're going to make that analysis, you must be very honest, and it must be very multivariate and go down. But one of the things that are problematic about the GBV issue is that we have a lot of activists that are uninformed, or that are informed by postmodernism. You understand? Yeah. So there is a lot of indoctrination on that is wrong, that yields us very terrible results. That's why we are failing. So we are not honest. Yes.
Okay, that's a powerful one. Let's bring it home now to us as Christians.
Yeah.
What is the role of the church in minimizing the rate of growth of GBV in Botswana? What role should the church play to curb?
Those are two questions. Which one am I answering?
Both of them. What role should the church play in reducing the rate of GBV?
Okay. The church, well, we need to understand critically from I'm moving away from the spiritual reflection of what the church is, to understand it in socio-economic and political epicenter. What we need to understand is that the church is a community-serving institution, right? And by that extension, if it's community-serving, that means it serves the community just in that, right? So the role of the church, what has been our role, is that we have been preaching reconciliation. We have been preaching love. We have been preaching, and love in its various manifestations, agape love, whatever that is, it eros or what, living, coexisting together peacefully, loving one another. And I believe that has been a strategy that has been working for us over the years to try and combat this anger, this malevolence, that's being carried by people. But of course, I believe that the church can could adjust and become a little bit more intentional and a little bit more radical in its attempt to address the social ills that we're experiencing, because the church is doing preaching, the church is doing counseling, and all these rehabilitation structures, but we are not really coming out clearly to define exactly or to respond exactly to this social ills. Right, we're doing a blanket. More preaching is more blanket. Yes,
it covers a whole lot
yeah,
of
we're
things.
just throwing the net there and we're saying, whoever hitting, we're hitting GBV, we're hitting HIV and AIDS, we're just a community serving institution. But I think what we need to do progressively, looking at our time, is to now build structures that will look at these things as responses. And the church should have a GBV response organ, right? The church should develop a theology around violence, develop a theology around things like HIV and AIDS and all of those things, and really be intentional about preaching it, about sensitizing, to develop better conflict resolution mechanisms within the church that allow people to come safely and say, I'm dealing with anger and I'm struggling with my wife, or I'm struggling with my partner, what can I do? And then we attend to that. Yes.
Okay. Let's say I give you the opportunity to ask me anything that you need to curb, to deal with GBV. What structures would you establish in your personal capacity that you say, this, I know if I put these structures together, I'll be able to deal with GBV?
I think education is a very powerful tool.
Education.
Right. I think education is a very powerful tool. Not education that has been, because the problem with education, and you'll see this problem also manifest in universities, right, is that education has been commercialized. And because it has been commercialized, it has been imperialized by different organs within our world, right? So there are people that benefit from the indoctrination of people believing that men and women are enemies and not allies. So when you continually indoctrinate people, for example, and telling them that we are living in this society and they are having GBV because GBV is a result of a patriarchal society, that men are dominant and they're occupying the hierarchies of power within a society, then you build a contention between men and women and you misread history. Because the truth of the matter is, men and women have been working together systematically through our history as allies and not as enemies to combat the terrible, the terrible and overwhelming burdens that come with being and that come with existing, right? But what you are seeing with the education right now is that, and also in this patriarchy, because we have represented patriarchy as a gender. Huh? When you think about patriarchy, you think man, right, as a gender. But the truth is, patriarchy is a system. It is not a gender. Patriarchy benefits men, patriarchy benefits women. Patriarchy disadvantages men, patriarchy disadvantages women. It's a system that does not recognize gender. But mainstream education right now, with postmodernist influences and neo-Marxism, tells you that patriarchy is a gender. So you have men feeling terrible for being born male, and you have women growing up and just hating a man simply because he's a man. Because education has been commercialized, there are people who benefit from making men and women enemies and not allies. What is the contention? The contention is that we remain so far back and we still turn in the wheel of the people that are commercializing and indoctrinating education. I could take this further.
All right.
Yeah.
So you strongly believe that because of not knowing much, we are unable to deal with GBV proper.
Yes. We are unable to deal with GBV properly because our education, because we don't have the right knowledge. The dispensary of knowledge has been hijacked has been taken over. Maybe to move further to stretch the resolution of the conversation that we just had about now. Like for example, when we talk about the patriarchy, yeah, the patriarchy, you just have people just fighting the patriarchy. I'll give you this example. The highest incarceration rate is men. The highest rate of people who die from violent crimes is men. We have over 1,000 years of military conscription, which is man, right? The highest rate of people on the streets is man. The highest rate of school dropouts is man. But you know what our society does? It takes a hyperstrata of hyper successful men, right? And then use it as a relative analysis between hyper poor or hyper poor, yeah, I think poor, of a hyper structure of women that are at the bottom. And then we use this as a representation of what our society looks like, right? And then you tell me there is a male dominance. Okay, where do we see the male dominance exactly? Is it because we have a male president? Is it because the highest rate of male presidents within the country are men? You are taking a hyper structure of men that are successful. Not every man becomes that, but when you take the number of men in prisons and the number of men that become CEOs, that become presidents, that become chief executive officers, it does not represent that. And why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing this up because there is gross indoctrination and miseducation, right? And because of that miseducation, we are not able to properly diagnose what the problems within our society is. And you should get me right. I am not undermining, minimizing, contrasting that there is violence on the side of women and that women are oppressed, right? But I am against the eternal victimization of women and portrayal as victims and the eternal portrayal of men as perpetrators, and we miss what is happening in the in-between and that we can do. So when we create men as enemies and you create women as enemies, you have these both genders that are supposed to be coexisting and they're working together as enemies, so we can't achieve anything. So most likely, we're not going to solve the GBV issue, the violence issue, in the next 50 years until we radically transform our education and become honest.
Okay. Because when you take education,
Yes.
it's something that for it to transition or to be put into people, it takes a longer period.
Yeah.
I'd say. What is it that we can do as of now that could be of effect? You know how it's an they give you something for that particular time before they can address the major issue or that. What do you think could be our shot?
Okay. I think I'm not really a big fan of suboptimal solutions. So I'm struggling to find suboptimal solutions. But philosophically speaking, I believe one of the reasons why we are where we are is because of suboptimal solutions and no long-term planning. So I'm really trying to reduce the resolution of my conversation to that, and I'm struggling. But yeah, I think what we should have is that when you look at one of the precursors of violence, right? Forget gender first, think violence. The precursors of violence are economic, right? Economic disenfranchisement, economic exclusion, right? You are unable to participate fairly or feel that you participate fairly in the economic constitution or carcass of your society or your organization. So what I think we need to do is that we need, as governments, we need as societies, to radically transform our economies to be inclusive and to fight economic injustices and to combat poverty. You'd realize that the more you combat poverty within people, because poverty demeans, dehumanizes, and takes away someone's dignity. So when someone has been dehumanized, when someone has been demeaned, when someone's dignity has been taken away, they are most likely to react and to live and to conduct themselves like an animal because their humanity has been taken away from them. And when we become violent to each other, we resemble, default, or we return to animal to default settings, you understand? But once we fight poverty, right? Once we conscientize people, then they can behave more humanly as opposed to returning to default settings, right? And then in that scheme, you realize that we have combated, we would have combated to a certain extent violence. I'll give you an example, maybe to solidify that, right? It's easier for us in the bush to fight, throw each other with things, right? When we disagree. It's harder to see that in a boardroom. Why? Because you have moved us economically. People that are sitting in a boardroom have access to a certain level of economic revenue. They have access to a certain level of education that brings them on board to come and be able to engage one another. So what happens is that when you do that, take that narrative analysis. When we do that, we improve people's education. We fight poverty. We have in turn combated violence within our societies. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to take you back a little bit.
Yes.
When we mentioned the Christian side of it,
Yeah.
you mentioned that maybe churches going forward, they could try to narrow their focus so that they can deal with gender-based violence. So what approach should be done or used to deal with it in that form within a church setup? Because you see the church, most churches, I know you're different, but most churches is like these things are taboos and we don't speak about them, we don't talk about them, we don't address them. So to break away from that mindset, what should the church do in a way that it will be effective in dealing with GBV on a narrower scale?
Okay. One of the things that I think, and this is a radical one, that I think is very important, is that we must educate clergymen, anybody that has access to people, right, and teaches society and configures the morality, the perception, or the worldview of society must be educated on social justice. Because one of the problems that you have is that, pastors or churches obtain a very influential position in the lives of people. What they say occupies and forms and becomes embedded in the lives of those people. But if you have a pastor who's not educated in social justice, what they will do is that they will keep reproducing and perpetuating the same old behavior that is not working for us as a society. So I think what is essential then is to make sure that every pastor must be educated. And I'm not talking education, where you are educated, you must hold a degree or you must hold what. They must be, if you are leading a church, it must be compulsory for you to undergo courses on social justice, to know conflict resolution, to know progressive behavior, and to be able to teach that. So I think that's number one. Number two, I think churches as very significant stakeholders in the socio-economic and political development of any state, they must be empowered in order for them to empower. I'll take an example of churches within Botswana. One of the reasons why I think we are also a little bit laid back is that churches are struggling, and they are struggling with trivial issues which legislation could be able to solve immediately, so that the churches can be concerned about the dire and the important things, or the important faculties of human development and human capital development within their churches. So churches right now are struggling with getting space to establish themselves. So you have a frustration where a church is struggling 5 years to find its feet. And in those 5 years of struggling, the church is committed economically. And where does it get the time then, or the organization or the function to begin to attend socially? You understand? So legislation on board that this is what we do for churches, right? Let them be given land, for example, so that they don't struggle with these issues, and then we can call upon them to say, what are you doing in your community, right? And there must be audits of churches, right? I believe that as a pastor. There must be audits of churches. I'm not talking tax only, but that's a subject of another day. In companies have what they called, what do they call? Community outreach, right? Sort of community outreach, right? Churches must have that. We must audit you as a church. Ever since you came to this community that you are in, what have you done? Right? Yes. So they must work in part with the various institutions that government have placed on board, right? If there is your development is on board, your rehabilitation centers on board, your prisons on board, all those churches must be affiliate in the behavioral change and rehabilitation of those people. Behavioral change and churches must rehabilitate couples that are coming in for counseling that are beating each other up, whether in physically or whether by words. You understand? Yeah.
Awesome. So, your final words to social groups, male, female, mothers, fathers?
Yes. I think one of the things that will become very critical for us is to return and revisit and revise our humanity, and again move in the spirit of love, because I believe the spirit of love is the basis upon which we will develop ourselves, is the basis upon which individually we will hold ourselves accountable, and that we will be able to have peace and harmony, which becomes the substratum of all development when there is peace. So I think let's return to love, and let's be mindful of the fact that we are not enemies. We are allies, right? We need to join our hands. Even though it's COVID-19, we may join our hands philosophically. Yes. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Bogopa. I really appreciate my time with you.
Yeah.
I'm going to be meeting you a whole lot. I'm not going to be disturbing you from now on. And, thank you so much.
Yeah.